Jack had always considered himself a devoted husband. After 20 years of marriage to Amber, he prided himself on being the kind of partner who paid attention to the little things. Her favorite flowers, the way she liked her coffee in the morning, and the fact that her 45th birthday was a milestone worth celebrating in style. He had spent weeks planning the perfect party. Something grand enough to honor the years they'd spent together, but intimate enough to reflect their life. The evening started as he'd hoped. Friends and family filled the rented event space, and laughter echoed through the air as guests mingled over drinks and music. Jack had worked tirelessly to ensure every detail was flawless. The catering was exquisite, the decorations elegant, and Amber's favorite jazz band played softly in the background. But as the night wore on, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Amber had been distant for weeks leading up to the party. She'd resisted his attempts to help with the planning, brushing him off with vague comments about having it under control. Now, even as guests complimented her and showered her with well wishes, she seemed distracted. She floated through the party like a host obligated to be there rather than someone celebrating her life's milestones. Jack tried to ignore it at first, telling himself she was just overwhelmed by the attention. But when he couldn't find her halfway through the evening, the unease settled into his chest like a heavy weight. "Have you seen Amber?" he asked a friend, scanning the room. "She was just here a few minutes ago," the friend replied, frowning. "Maybe she stepped out for some air?" Jack nodded, forcing a smile, but his mind raced as he headed toward the door. The chilly night air hit him as he stepped into the parking lot, the faint hum of the party fading behind him. At first, everything seemed quiet, but then he heard faint laughter coming from around the corner. Following the sound, Jack turned the corner and froze. There, leaning casually against a car, was Amber. She wasn't alone. A man in a cheap suit, the kind of outfit that screamed ill-prepared and careless, stood close to her. Too close. Amber's laughter was unmistakable, her hand resting lightly on the man's arm as they talked in hushed tones. She didn't notice Jack at first, too engrossed in whatever joke or story the man was telling. But when her eyes finally met Jack's, her expression shifted from amusement to something colder, indifference. "Amber," Jack said, his voice low but trembling with disbelief. "What the hell is this?" The man straightened up, looking uneasy, but Amber didn't flinch. She crossed her arms, her lips curving into a faint smirk that sent a chill down Jack's spine. "It's nothing," she said dismissively. "We were just talking." "Talking?" Jack repeated, his voice rising. "At your birthday party? While I'm inside with all your friends and family, making sure everything is perfect for you." Amber sighed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Jack, please, don't make a scene. It's just one night for myself." "Can't I have that?" Jack stared at her, his mind reeling. "One night for yourself?" he repeated, incredulous. "What does that even mean, Amber? Who is this guy?" The man shifted uncomfortably, mumbling something about needing to leave, but Amber waved him off. "Go back inside, Jack," she said, her tone dismissive. "Enjoy the party. I'll be there in a minute." It wasn't just her words. It was the way she said them, as if Jack's presence was an inconvenience, as if he were the one ruining her evening. The indifference in her eyes cut deeper than any argument they'd ever had. Jack felt the ground shift beneath him, the years they'd spent building a life together suddenly feeling like a fragile illusion. He took a step back, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You don't even care, do you?" he asked quietly. Amber rolled her eyes, her patience clearly wearing thin. "Jack, you're overreacting. It's not a big deal." But to Jack, it was everything. Without another word, he turned and walked back inside, his chest tight and his mind spinning. The party continued around him, the guests oblivious to what had just happened. Jack plastered on a smile and made excuses for Amber's absence. But inside, something had broken. That night, as he lay in bed alone, Jack stared at the ceiling, replaying the scene in his mind. Her laughter, her indifference, her refusal to acknowledge what she had done. It all echoed in his head. The woman he thought he knew had become a stranger, and the trust he had placed in her was shattered. For Jack, the realization was clear. This wasn't just a momentary lapse. It was a crack in the foundation of their marriage, one that he couldn't ignore. The morning after Amber's birthday party, the house was unnervingly quiet. Jack sat at the kitchen table with a steaming cup of coffee, but his appetite was non-existent. His mind churned as he replayed the events of the night before. The parking lot, Amber's cold indifference, her dismissive words. He had barely slept, spending most of the night staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of the person Amber had become. The woman who had laughed at his jokes, held his hand through hard times, and shared her dreams with him now felt like a stranger. The sound of Amber's footsteps descending the stairs broke his train of thought. She entered the kitchen, looking composed, as though nothing had happened. She didn't offer an apology, didn't ask how he was feeling. She simply poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down across from him. "We need to talk," Jack said, his voice steady but tense. Amber raised an eyebrow, taking a sip of her coffee. "About what?" she asked, her tone almost bored. "About last night," Jack replied, leaning forward. "About you disappearing from your own party to meet some guy in the parking lot. About the fact that you don't even seem to care." Amber sighed, setting her mug down. "Jack, I don't want to argue. Can't we just let it go?" "No," Jack said firmly, his voice rising slightly. "We can't just let it go. I want answers, Amber. Who was that guy? And why are you acting like our marriage doesn't matter?" Amber's eyes narrowed, her posture stiffening. "You're blowing this out of proportion," she said. "It was just a moment, Jack. You don't have to make it into some big, dramatic thing." "Blowing it out of proportion?" Jack repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Amber, you were with another man, at your birthday party, that I planned for you. How is that not a big deal?" Amber's jaw tightened, and for a moment, she didn't respond. Then, she sighed again, her tone softer but laced with frustration. "Look, Jack, I'm tired. Okay? Tired of this routine. Every day is the same. The same house, the same conversations, the same expectations. I feel like I'm suffocating." Her words hit Jack like a punch to the gut. He stared at her, his chest tightening. "Suffocating?" he asked quietly. "From what, Amber? The life we built together? The family we've created?" Amber avoided his gaze, staring into her coffee cup instead. "I don't know how to explain it," she said after a moment. "It's not about you, Jack. It's about me. I feel like I deserve more. Like I need something different. Something exciting." Jack's hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the table. Her words cut deep, each one like a dagger twisting in his chest. "You deserve more?" he repeated, his voice shaking. "More than what? A husband who loves you? A home? Stability? A life we've built together?" Amber finally looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "I'm not saying I don't appreciate what we have," she said. "But can't you see it's not enough for me anymore?" Jack leaned back in his chair, stunned into silence. He had expected excuses, maybe even an apology, but not this. Not an open admission that their life, the life he had worked so hard to build, was no longer enough for her. "So what?" he asked bitterly. "You're bored with our marriage, so you just decide to throw it away? To sneak around with strangers instead of talking to me?" Amber flinched slightly but didn't deny it. "I didn't mean for it to get to this point," she said quietly. "But maybe I needed to do something for myself for once." Jack's hands clenched into fists, his jaw tightening as he fought back the wave of anger threatening to consume him. "You don't care, do you?" he said, his voice low and bitter. "You don't care about me, about us. You've already decided we don't matter." Amber looked away, her silence confirming what Jack had feared. He stood abruptly, pushing his chair back with a scrape. "You've made yourself perfectly clear, Amber," he said coldly. "You're tired of this life. You think you deserve more. Well, congratulations, you've just destroyed everything we've built. I hope it was worth it." Amber didn't respond as Jack stormed out of the kitchen, his chest heaving with a mix of anger and heartbreak. For the first time, he truly understood that Amber no longer cared about their marriage. And for Jack, that realization was the beginning of the end. The night after Amber's cold confession was one of the longest of Jack's life. He had left the house in a whirlwind of frustration and pain, driving aimlessly through the quiet streets of their suburban neighborhood. Sleep was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, Amber's words echoed in his mind. "I feel like I deserve more." By the time the sun rose, Jack had made a decision. He wasn't going to keep spiraling in uncertainty. He needed answers, the full truth, no matter how much it hurt. When he returned home, the house was silent. Amber wasn't there. Probably at work, or more likely, off doing whatever exciting thing she thought she deserved. The emptiness of the house felt like a physical presence, cold and uninviting. Jack stood in the entryway for a moment, then made his way to the kitchen, where he spotted Amber's laptop on the counter. She had always been protective of her laptop, rarely letting anyone use it and keeping it password protected. But Jack remembered her password. It hadn't changed in years. Something in him hesitated as he opened the lid, but his need for the truth overpowered the nagging voice in his head telling him to stop. The screen lit up, and after a few keystrokes, he was in. At first, everything looked normal. Emails, work documents, and a few shopping tabs. But then Jack saw a folder buried within her email account labeled Personal. His heart pounded as he clicked it open, revealing a string of emails that sent a cold wave through his body. The messages were from someone named Richard. Jack read them in stunned silence, each word cutting deeper than the last. The correspondence was explicit, affectionate, and full of plans. Plans that didn't include Jack. One email from Richard read, "I can't wait until we don't have to hide anymore. Just a few more months, and we'll finally be together. I love you, Amber." Another message from Amber made Jack's stomach twist. "I'm counting down the days. Jack has no idea. It's been hard pretending, but it'll be worth it once I'm with you." The dates on the emails stretched back 11 months. Amber's affair hadn't been a fleeting mistake. It had been a calculated betrayal, sustained and nurtured while Jack had worked tirelessly to support her and their life together. But the final email was what broke him. "I've decided to tell Jack after my birthday. It'll be easier once the party is behind us. I'm packing my things little by little so I can leave without much fuss. I don't want drama. I just want to start fresh with you." Jack slammed the laptop shut, his hands shaking with rage. The timing was clear now. Amber hadn't just been avoiding him recently. She had been systematically preparing to leave him for Richard. Even the party he had planned with so much love and care had been nothing more than a charade to her, a way to keep up appearances until her escape was ready. The betrayal felt like a crushing weight on his chest. Jack sat at the kitchen table, staring at the closed laptop as his mind raced. For 11 months, Amber had lied to his face, smiled at him, shared a bed with him, all while plotting to destroy their marriage. The pain was unbearable, but beneath it, a new feeling began to rise. Resolve. Amber thought she had control, thought she could walk out of his life on her terms and leave him to pick up the pieces. But Jack wasn't going to let that happen. If she wanted to fight for herself, then Jack would fight for himself too. And he would make damn sure she faced the consequences of her actions. For the first time since the nightmare had begun, Jack felt a strange sense of clarity. He wasn't just a victim in Amber's game, he was a participant. And now it was his move. Jack sat at the kitchen table, the laptop still in front of him, as the sound of Amber's car pulling into the driveway broke the silence. He straightened, his jaw tight and his fists clenched. The pain of her betrayal still burned, but now it was layered with a simmering determination. Tonight, there would be no more lies, no more pretending. The front door opened, and Amber walked in, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She paused when she saw him, her expression shifting from mild surprise to guarded curiosity. "Hey," she said, setting her purse down. "You're up late." Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood, closing the laptop and placing it gently on the table. "We need to talk," he said, his voice calm but firm. Amber hesitated, her smile faltering. "What's this about?" "You already know," Jack replied. his eyes boring into hers. "I found the emails, Amber. I know everything." Her face froze, the blood draining from her cheeks. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Finally, she managed to stammer, "Jack, I can explain." "Don't." Jack cut her off sharply. "Don't insult me with excuses. You've been lying to me for nearly a year, planning to leave me for him. You didn't even have the decency to tell me the truth." Amber's shock quickly turned to defiance. She crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "And what would telling you have changed, Jack? You would have just tried to guilt me into staying. I'm tired of this marriage. Tired of feeling invisible and unimportant." Jack's eyes narrowed. "Invisible? Unimportant? Amber, I've spent the past 7 years trying to give you the life you wanted. I've supported you in every way I could. And this is how you repay me? You think this is just about you?" Amber snapped, her voice rising. "You're so focused on work, on providing for us, that you forgot how to actually be a husband. I felt alone in this marriage for years. Richard made me feel alive again." Jack let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "So this is my fault? You're the one who cheated, Amber. You're the one who lied. Don't you dare stand there and try to make me the villain in this." Amber stepped closer, her tone turning icy. "If you'd been a better husband, this wouldn't have happened." Jack felt his fists tighten at his sides, but he forced himself to stay calm. He stared at her for a long moment, then turned and walked to the kitchen counter, pulling a folder from the drawer. He placed it on the table and slid it toward her. "What's this?" Amber asked, eyeing it warily. "Divorce papers," Jack said evenly. "You're going to sign them, and then you're going to pack your things and leave." Amber's eyes widened, the color returning to her face in a flush of anger. "You're kicking me out? This is my house too, Jack." "No," Jack said coldly. "This was our house. But you gave that up the moment you decided to betray me." Amber opened the folder, scanning the papers inside. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she realized Jack wasn't bluffing. "And if I don't sign?" Jack leaned forward, his voice low and unyielding. "If you don't sign, I'll make sure Richard knows exactly what kind of person you are. And I'll take this to court, where your affair and your emails will be laid bare for everyone to see. You'll walk away with nothing, Amber. Don't test me." Amber glared at him, but Jack could see the fear flicker in her eyes. She knew he had the upper hand, and she knew he wasn't bluffing. After a long moment, she grabbed the pen from the table and began signing the papers with quick, jerky movements. When she finished, she shoved the folder back toward him. "Fine," she spat. "But don't think for a second that this makes you the hero. You were a terrible husband, Jack. This marriage was dead long before Richard came along." Jack stared at her, his expression hard but calm. "You might believe that, Amber, but the truth is, you killed this marriage the moment you chose to betray me. Now, get your things and go." Amber's face twisted with fury, but she said nothing. She stormed out of the room, slamming the door to their bedroom behind her. Jack stood in the kitchen, his hands trembling as the weight of the confrontation settled over him. It was over. The life they had built together, the future he had once envisioned, it was all gone. But as painful as it was, Jack knew he had made the right decision. Amber had made her choices, and now it was time for Jack to start making his. When Amber left the house later that night, dragging a suitcase behind her, Jack didn't watch her go. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table, staring at the signed divorce papers. It wasn't the ending he had imagined, but it was the beginning of something new. A life free of lies, betrayal, and the woman who had tried to tear him down. The morning after Amber left, Jack knew it was time to have the hardest conversation of all. Sophie and Chris, their 2 children, were away at college, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing back home. Jack had hoped to shield them from the pain, but now there was no avoiding it. They deserved to know the truth, at least as much of it as they could handle. Sitting at the kitchen table, Jack stared at his phone, the weight of what he was about to do pressing heavily on his chest. He dialed Sophie first, his eldest. At 20, she was mature and empathetic, always the emotional anchor of the family. "Hey, Dad." Sophie's voice was warm and cheerful. The sound of it made Jack's heart ache. "Hey, sweetheart," Jack said, trying to keep his tone steady. "Do you have a minute to talk?" "Of course. Is everything okay?" she asked, her tone immediately shifting to concern. Jack hesitated, searching for the right words. "Not really. I wanted to tell you this in person, but, well, things have happened faster than I expected. Your mom and we're getting a divorce." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Jack could hear Sophie's breath hitch. "What?" she whispered. "Why? What happened?" Jack sighed, leaning his elbows on the table. "It's complicated, Sophie. Let's just say, your mom made some choices that broke our trust. I don't want to go into the details, but it's over. She left last night." Sophie's voice broke as she asked, "She left? Just like that?" "She took some of her things and left the house," Jack said gently. "But I want you to know that this doesn't change anything between us. I'm still here for you and Chris always." Sophie began to cry, her sobs muffled but heart-wrenching. "I can't believe this is happening," she said through her tears. "I thought you and Mom were okay." "I know," Jack said softly, his own voice trembling. "I thought so too, but things weren't what they seemed." "Does Chris know?" Sophie asked, her voice shaky. "Not yet," Jack admitted. "I wanted to talk to you first. I'll call him next." Sophie sniffled, taking a deep breath. "Okay, I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry, Dad." "You don't have to say anything, sweetheart," Jack said gently. "Just know that I love you, and I'm always here for you. We'll get through this together." "I love you too," Sophie said quietly. "Please let me know if you need anything." "I will," Jack promised. "And if you need to talk, I'm just a call away." After they hung up, Jack sat in silence for a moment, bracing himself before dialing Chris. His 18-year-old son was less emotionally expressive than Sophie, but Jack knew this news would hit him hard. "Hey, Dad," Chris answered, his voice casual. "Hey, Bud," Jack said. "Do you have a minute? I need to talk to you about something important." "Sure," Chris said, his tone shifting. "What's up?" Jack took a deep breath. "Your mom and I are getting a divorce." Chris was silent for a moment before replying, his voice tense. "Why? What happened?" "Your mom made some decisions that hurt our family," Jack said carefully, trying not to say more than was necessary. "We've decided it's best to go our separate ways." "Did she cheat on you?" Chris asked bluntly, his tone sharp. Jack hesitated, caught off guard by the directness of the question. "Chris, it's complicated. I don't want to get into the details right now, but yes, there were betrayals." Chris swore under his breath. "I can't believe her. How could she do this to you? To us?" "I don't have all the answers," Jack said softly, "but I need you to know that no matter what happens, I'm here for you. This doesn't change how much I love you or your sister." Chris's voice was tight with anger. "I'm so mad at her, Dad. I don't even want to talk to her right now." "I understand," Jack said gently, "but don't let this make you bitter, Chris. It's okay to be angry, but don't let it consume you. We'll get through this together." Chris sighed heavily. "Yeah, okay. Thanks for telling me, Dad. I'm sorry you're dealing with this." "Thanks, Bud," Jack said. "And remember, I'm always here if you need to talk." "I know," Chris said. "I love you, Dad." "I love you too," Jack replied. After the call, Jack set his phone down and leaned back in his chair, the weight of the conversation settling over him. It had been painful, but he felt a sense of relief knowing that Sophie and Chris understood the situation. The road ahead would be difficult, but Jack was determined to keep his promise to his children. No matter how much had been lost, they still had each other, and that was enough to start rebuilding. Amber's departure marked the beginning of a new, quieter chapter in Jack's life. The house felt emptier without her, but not in the painful way he'd feared. Instead, it was a peaceful emptiness, a space free from deceit and tension. His focus shifted entirely to his children and the life they would rebuild together. Amber, meanwhile, moved into a small apartment in another part of the city. It was a far cry from the spacious home she and Jack had shared, and the adjustment was clearly not easy for her. Jack heard through mutual acquaintances that she struggled to settle into her new life, the cracks in her once confident exterior becoming increasingly visible. First, Amber tried to reach out to Sophie and Chris. She sent messages, made calls, and even showed up unannounced on Sophie's campus one afternoon. Sophie was polite but distant, keeping the interaction brief. "I'm not ready to talk to you yet, Mom," she had said, her voice heavy with disappointment. Chris, on the other hand, was more direct. When Amber called him, he barely let her speak before cutting her off. "You made your choice," he said coldly. "Now you have to live with it. Don't call me again." Amber was devastated, but Jack couldn't bring himself to feel sympathy. She had brought this on herself, and the consequences of her actions were finally catching up with her. While Amber floundered, Jack worked quietly and methodically to secure his future and protect his children. He had already filed for divorce, but now he focused on gathering the evidence needed to ensure that the proceedings would go in his favor. With the help of his lawyer, Jack began piecing together a detailed record of Amber's financial indiscretions. She had spent thousands of dollars on her affair, hotel stays, expensive gifts, and even lavish dinners charged to their shared credit card. There were also cash withdrawals that coincided suspiciously with the times she claimed to be at work conferences or visiting friends. Jack's lawyer, a sharp and pragmatic woman named Eleanor, was impressed by the thoroughness of the documentation. "This paints a very clear picture," she said during one of their meetings. "Amber's spending habits, combined with the evidence of her affair, give us a strong case for favorable divorce terms. If she tries to push back, this will make it nearly impossible for her to claim more than she's entitled to." Jack nodded, his resolve hardening. "I'm not trying to ruin her, Eleanor, but I'm not going to let her walk away with more than she deserves, either. My priority is protecting Sophie and Chris." "And that's exactly what we'll do," Eleanor assured him. As the divorce proceedings began, Amber's attempts to regain control of the narrative became more desperate. She argued that she had been unhappy in the marriage for years, claiming that Jack's focus on work had left her feeling neglected. But the evidence Jack and his lawyer presented dismantled her arguments piece by piece. Amber's financial records, the timeline of her affair, and even her text messages to her lover painted a damning picture. The judge saw through her excuses, and the terms of the divorce heavily favored Jack. By the time the final ruling was issued, Amber was left with little more than her small apartment and a modest monthly allowance. Jack retained full ownership of the house, along with primary custody of Sophie and Chris, though the latter was more symbolic than practical, given their ages. For Amber, the loss was devastating. She had not only destroyed her marriage but also alienated her children and tarnished her reputation. Jack, on the other hand, felt a sense of closure as he walked out of the courtroom that day. The legal battle was over, and he could finally focus on moving forward. Amber's choices had left a trail of destruction, but Jack was determined to build something better for himself and his children. Amber tried one last time to reach out to Sophie and Chris, leaving tearful voicemails and writing long, apologetic emails. Sophie read the messages but didn't reply, still too hurt to engage. Chris, true to his word, deleted them without a second thought. Amber was left alone, her life reduced to the consequences of her own actions. Meanwhile, Jack focused on rebuilding, drawing strength from his children and the new life they were beginning to shape together. In the weeks following the divorce's conclusion, Jack threw himself into rebuilding his life. It wasn't just about moving on from Amber. It was about rediscovering who he was without the shadow of her betrayal looming over him. He knew he needed to focus on what truly mattered, his children, his health, and the parts of his life that gave him a sense of purpose. Work became his anchor. Jack had always been dedicated to his job, but now it felt like a lifeline, something that gave structure to his days and kept his mind busy. His co-workers noticed the shift in him. He was more focused, more determined, and his projects began to take on a new level of excellence. For the first time in years, Jack felt like he was thriving professionally, and the recognition from his peers only fueled his momentum. But it wasn't enough to simply excel at work. Jack knew he needed to take care of himself in other ways too. One morning, he laced up a pair of running shoes that had been gathering dust in his closet and headed to the local gym. The first few sessions were rough. His muscles ached, and he was painfully aware of how out of shape he'd become. But Jack stuck with it, pushing himself a little harder each day. Over time, the weights felt lighter, his stamina improved, and he began to look forward to the endorphin rush that came after a good workout. The changes weren't just physical. As Jack grew stronger, he felt a renewed sense of confidence and energy. The gym became more than a place to exercise. It was a symbol of his resilience, a reminder that he could rebuild not just his body but his entire life. Of course, the most important part of his life was his children. Sophie and Chris were both busy with college, but Jack made it a point to stay closely connected to them. They had weekly video calls, where Sophie updated him on her dance classes and Chris shared stories about his latest engineering projects. On weekends, when they visited, Jack took them out to their favorite restaurants or cooked family dinners at home. One evening, Sophie sat with him at the kitchen table, sipping tea as they chatted. "You seem different, Dad," she said, studying him with a thoughtful expression. "Different how?" Jack asked, smiling. "Better," Sophie replied. "Happier. It's nice to see." Jack's smile widened. "Thanks, sweetheart. I guess I've realized that sometimes you have to let go of the things holding you back before you can really move forward." A few days later, Jack received a call from Michael, his oldest friend. Michael had been a constant source of support throughout the ordeal, always ready to lend an ear or offer advice. "Jack, you need a break," Michael said over the phone. "Come over for dinner this Friday. It'll be good for you." Jack hesitated for a moment before agreeing. "All right, I'll be there." When Friday evening rolled around, Jack found himself at Michael's house, the familiar warmth of his friend's home instantly putting him at ease. They sat in the dining room, sharing a meal that Michael had cooked himself. The food was simple but delicious, and the conversation flowed easily, filled with laughter and reminiscing. "Remember that camping trip back in college?" Michael said, grinning as he leaned back in his chair. "The one where you thought you could wrestle that raccoon for your backpack?" Jack chuckled, shaking his head. "In my defense, that raccoon was unnaturally aggressive, and I still say I had a chance." Michael burst out laughing, and Jack couldn't help but join in. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt completely relaxed, the weight of the past few months momentarily lifted. "You're doing good, Jack," Michael said, his tone turning more serious. "I can see it. You're rebuilding, and it's inspiring. Not everyone bounces back like this." Jack nodded, his smile softening. "It's been hard, but I've realized I can't let what happened define me. I have too much to live for." As the evening wound down, Jack left Michael's house feeling lighter than he had in months. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, he felt like he was heading in the right direction. Jack wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living. And with each passing day, he grew more certain that the future held something better, not just for himself but for the people who mattered most in his life. The sun was just beginning to rise as Jack sat at his kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in one hand and a pen in the other. The soft light filtered through the window, casting a golden glow on the blank sheet of paper before him. It felt like a fitting metaphor for his life, a blank slate, ready to be filled with whatever he chose. For the first time in years, Jack wasn't looking back. He wasn't thinking about the betrayal or the pain that had dominated his thoughts for so long. Instead, he was focused on what lay ahead. With a deep breath, he put pen to paper, writing at the top, "Goals for my new life." He thought of the things he'd always wanted to do but had put off for one reason or another. He had dreamed of hitting the open road, exploring new places, and feeling the freedom of endless highways beneath his wheels. He had always wanted to learn the guitar, imagining himself strumming a few chords, maybe even singing along, badly but happily. And there was something about the simplicity of fishing that called to him, reminding him of quiet mornings spent with his father by the lake, the patience and peace of waiting for a catch. Jack listed these ideas down, each one representing something simple yet meaningful, a way to reclaim joy and live life on his own terms. Later that morning, he decided to take the first step. He packed a small bag and drove to the music store downtown. For an hour, he browsed the guitars, finally settling on an acoustic model that felt just right in his hands. The salesman showed him a few basics, and by the time Jack left the store, he was grinning like a kid with a new toy. That evening, he sat on the porch with the guitar resting on his lap, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. His fingers fumbled awkwardly through a few beginner chords, the sound rough but satisfying. Each note was a small victory, a step toward something new. The road trip came a week later. Jack mapped out a route that blended scenic highways with off-the-beaten-path destinations, packing light and taking only the essentials. The drive was everything he had hoped for. Rolling hills, winding mountain roads, and the charm of roadside diners and quirky antique shops. At night, he stayed in small motels, falling asleep to the sounds of crickets chirping outside his window. On the 5th day of his trip, Jack found himself at a quiet lake. He rented a fishing rod from a nearby bait shop and spent hours sitting on the dock, the gentle ripple of the water soothing his soul. He caught 2 fish, both of which he released, but the catch wasn't the point. It was the stillness, the simplicity, and the feeling of being entirely present in the moment. When he finally returned home, Jack felt like a different person. The weight of the past had lifted, replaced by a sense of peace and hope he hadn't known in years. One evening, as he sat in the living room with the guitar in his hands, Jack glanced at a piece of paper pinned to the fridge. It was the list he'd written that morning weeks ago, the goals that had once seemed like distant dreams. Now, each one had a small checkmark next to it, a tangible reminder of how far he'd come. His life was no longer dictated by betrayal or pain. It was his own, shaped by his choices and guided by truth. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt truly free. As he strummed a soft melody, the notes filling the quiet room, he smiled to himself. The journey wasn't over, it was only just beginning.